The boy entered the mansion and found the millionaire alone in the empty room. When he opened his mouth and said those words, the man broke down in tears. The child in the grey t-shirt was crying uncontrollably. His face was red and wet as the man in the black suit held him in his arms, kneeling on the light marble floor. Victor pressed the boy against his chest and felt the small body tremble in his arms. The loud crying echoed through the empty room, filling the cold silence that had dominated that mansion for months. The boy's name was David, and he was only 7 years old. His face was streaked with tears that wouldn't stop falling, his eyes swollen and red from crying so much, his breathing ragged and difficult. Victor looked at him, not fully understanding what was happening, but something inside him broke at that moment. Something he thought he could never feel again after everything he had lost. David grabbed the sleeve of the black suit with his 2 small dust-covered hands, as if afraid the man would leave and abandon him again. He continued crying, unable to speak clearly, just sobbing and trying to catch his breath between tears. Victor slowly ran his hand through the boy's hair, feeling the fine, messy texture, and realized he was trembling not just from emotion, but also from the cold, because the grey t-shirt he was wearing was too thin for the icy wind blowing in through the mansion's open windows. The entire house felt too empty, too vast, too silent, and now with the boy's desperate crying, everything seemed even heavier and more suffocating. Victor didn't know who this boy was, how he had gotten into the mansion or what he wanted. But the moment David spoke those words, everything changed. Everything collapsed inside him like a building falling in slow motion. The boy had said he was alone, that he had no one left, that he had seen the light on in the mansion and came in because he didn't know where else to go, because he was scared, because he was lost. Victor felt his chest tighten with a pain he hadn't felt in a long time. A pain he had buried deep after losing his wife and son in a terrible accident that destroyed his entire life in a matter of seconds. He had shut himself off from the world, abandoned everything, quit his businesses, stopped talking to people, isolating himself in that huge, cold mansion as if he could disappear along with the grief. But now, holding this boy, crying and shaking, Victor felt something different, something he never expected to feel again. David lifted his wet face and looked at him with tear-filled eyes, his mouth trembling as he tried to speak again, murmuring in a thin, broken voice, "I don't want to be alone." The words came out choked by sobs. "I'm scared of the dark." And then he lowered his head again, sobbing harder. "I don't know where my mum is." Victor swallowed hard and felt his own tears start to stream down his face, unable to control them. Because those were the same words he heard in his head every day, the same words his son used to say before bed, the same words he never got to hear again after that horrible day. He squeezed David tighter and rested his forehead against the boy's head, closing his eyes and letting the tears fall freely, without trying to hide, without trying to be strong, just feeling everything all at once, all the pain, all the longing, all the guilt he carried inside him like a crushing weight. David stopped crying for a few seconds and went quiet, just breathing along with Victor. Both of them knelt on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the empty luxury of that mansion that meant nothing anymore. Victor slowly opened his eyes and looked around the enormous room, seeing the furniture covered in white sheets, the heavy curtains blocking the sunlight, the paintings turned toward the wall, because he couldn't bear to see the faces of the people he loved who were no longer there. Everything in that house was a reminder of what he had lost. Everything was a painful memory he tried to forget, but which haunted him every day. David stirred in his arms and sobbed again, wiping his nose with his hand and leaving a wet mark on Victor's suit sleeve. But Victor didn't care, he didn't mind any of it. He just held the boy and stayed there, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say, just feeling. Silence returned to the room, but now it was different. It was no longer the empty, suffocating silence from before. It was a shared silence, a silence that said more than any words ever could. Victor took a deep breath and finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse and trembling. "How did you get in here?" David lifted his red eyes to him, still crying softly, and answered in a voice that was barely a whisper. "The gate was open," and he sniffled. "I saw the light and thought someone could help me." Victor felt his heart clench again, because he himself had left the gate open. He had forgotten to close it after returning from another empty day, wandering aimlessly through the city, trying to escape the ghosts that haunted him inside that house. He looked at the boy and saw in his eyes the same desperation he felt every day, the same loneliness that consumed him inside, the same pain of someone who had lost everything and didn't know how to move forward. Victor wiped his own tears with the back of his hand and tried to compose himself, but it was impossible, because everything inside him was crumbling at that moment. Everything he had built to protect himself from the pain was falling apart. David kept looking at him with those big, frightened eyes, waiting for an answer, a word of comfort, something to make the fear go away. Victor ran a hand over his face and took another deep breath, trying to find the strength to speak, and said, his voice still shaking, "Are you alone? Is there no one with you?" David shook his head slowly, the tears starting to fall harder again. "And my mum left for work yesterday morning and never came back," and his voice broke mid-sentence. "I waited all day. I waited all night and she didn't show up." Victor felt a wave of despair wash over him, because he knew exactly what that meant. He knew what it was like to wait for someone who would never return. He knew what it was like to be suddenly alone, without understanding what had happened. He pulled David closer and hugged the boy tightly, feeling the small body tremble against his own, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." The words came out almost soundless, full of emotion. "I'm here now." David clung to him with all his strength, burying his face in Victor's chest and crying even harder, releasing all the pain and fear he had held inside since waking up alone that morning and realizing his mother wasn't home. Victor continued holding the boy and felt something inside him begin to shift. Something that had been dead for a long time was starting to awaken again, and he didn't know if it was good or bad, dangerous or necessary, but he knew he couldn't leave this boy alone. He couldn't turn his back on him and pretend nothing had happened. They stayed there for long minutes, embracing on the cold floor of that enormous room, as the sun began to set outside and the afternoon shadows invaded the mansion, making everything even more silent and heavy. Victor finally moved and helped David stand up, carefully holding the boy's small hand, and looked at him again, seeing his swollen red face, his eyes tired from crying so much, his clothes dirty and wrinkled. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to care for a child, didn't know how to handle the situation, but he knew he had to do something. He had to help somehow. Victor looked around the room again and felt the weight of that house fall upon him. The weight of all the bad memories, all the empty days, all the loneliness that had accumulated inside. David squeezed his hand and whispered, his voice still tearful, "Are you alone too, mister?" And those words hit Victor like a punch to the gut, because he had never admitted it out loud. He had never let anyone see how lost and destroyed he was inside. He looked at the boy and couldn't lie. He couldn't pretend everything was fine. He just nodded slowly and felt the tears well up in his eyes again. David continued looking at him with that expression of someone who perfectly understood what the other was feeling and said in a weak voice, "Then can we be alone together?" And those simple words, spoken by a 7-year-old who didn't fully grasp the weight of what he was saying, struck Victor deep in his soul and made something inside him finally break. He couldn't answer. He just pulled the boy into another hug and let the tears fall non-stop, feeling for the first time in a long time that maybe he didn't have to carry all that pain alone, that maybe there was some meaning in continuing to live, even if it was just to be there for this boy who had appeared out of nowhere in his life. Victor slowly pulled David away and looked into his eyes, wiping the tears from the boy's face with trembling hands, and said with a choked voice, "Have you eaten anything today?" David shook his head no, his lips trembling again. "I didn't have anything at home," and he lowered his eyes, embarrassed. "I went out looking for help." Victor felt his heart clench even tighter, because this boy had spent at least an entire day alone, hungry, scared, with no one to care for him, and had walked the streets until he found that mansion and entered, hoping to find someone who could help him. Victor slowly stood up, still holding David's hand, and said in a firmer voice, "Come with me now. I'm going to make you something to eat." And he started walking toward the kitchen, pulling the boy along. David followed without letting go of his hand, his small, tired steps echoing on the marble floor as they crossed the mansion's empty corridors. Victor hadn't been in the kitchen for weeks, maybe months, because he barely ate properly, barely cared about his own life, but now someone was depending on him. Someone needed him, and that changed everything. They reached the huge modern kitchen, with granite countertops and expensive appliances, that hadn't been used in a long time. Victor let go of David's hand to open the refrigerator, finding only a few old expired items he didn't even remember buying. He closed the fridge and looked at the boy standing in the middle of the kitchen, arms crossed over his chest, shivering from cold and exhaustion. And Victor realized he needed to do more than just feed him. He needed to take proper care of him. He needed to make sure he was okay. Victor opened the cabinets and found some pasta, some canned goods, and decided to make something quick and warm for the boy to eat. He turned on the stove and started preparing a simple meal, while David watched in silence, still scared, still not fully understanding what was happening. Victor glanced at the boy occasionally while cooking, seeing his tired face, his swollen eyes, and felt a mixture of sadness and determination grow inside him, because he knew he couldn't let that boy go back to the streets. He couldn't just hand him over to the authorities and continue his empty life as if nothing had happened. David slowly approached and stood beside him, looking at the pot on the stove, and whispered, "Do you live alone in this whole house, mister?" Victor nodded, stirring the food without looking at the boy. "Yes, I live alone." His voice came out heavy, laden with pain. David was silent for a few seconds, and then asked in an even lower voice, "Did you lose someone too?" Victor stopped stirring the food and closed his eyes, feeling his throat tighten again, because that simple question touched a wound he tried to ignore every day. He opened his eyes and looked at David, seeing the same pain he carried reflected in the boy's eyes, and answered with a trembling voice, "I lost my wife and my son." The words came out slowly, each one hurting like a stab. They were in an accident 2 years ago. David lowered his head and stayed quiet. And Victor saw tears start to fall on the boy's face again. He knelt down in front of David and held his shoulders gently. "But now you're here and I'm going to take care of you, okay?" David lifted his tear-filled eyes and nodded slowly, his mouth trembling as he tried to speak. "I'm scared my mom is never coming back." His voice was broken, full of despair. Victor pulled the boy into another tight hug and said in a firm voice, trying to convey security, even though he didn't know if he could keep that promise, "I will find out what happened to your mother, I promise." David clung to him again, crying softly against his chest. Victor stayed there, hugging the boy for a few more minutes, until the food in the pot started to bubble. He stood up again and returned to the stove, finishing the simple pasta with tomato sauce, which was all he could find in the pantry. He served a generous plate for David and placed it on the table, pulling up a chair for the boy to sit. David looked at the food with eyes still wet, but with an expression of relief on his face. Victor stood watching as the boy ate slowly, clearly starving, but trying to control himself, and felt a mix of emotions wash over him, because seeing that boy there in his kitchen, eating the food he had prepared, reminded him of what it was like to have someone to care for, what it was like to have a purpose in life, beyond just existing and counting the days until everything ended. David ate almost everything on the plate, and then looked up at Victor with tired eyes, his mouth smeared with sauce, and whispered, "Thank you." And that simple word hit Victor with a force he hadn't expected, because he hadn't heard anyone thank him for anything in so long that he had forgotten how good it felt to be useful. Victor grabbed a napkin and gently wiped the boy's face and said in a softer voice, "You must be very tired. I'm going to take you to a room where you can rest." David nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with sleep and exhaustion. Victor helped the boy down from the chair and held his hand again, guiding him through the dark corridors of the mansion until they reached the second floor, where there were several empty rooms that hadn't been used for years. He opened the door to one of the smaller rooms, one that had a twin bed and some simple furniture, and turned on the light, revealing a clean space, but clearly abandoned for a long time. Victor entered the room, pulling David along, and went to the closet, looking for some bedding that was in good condition, and found some clean sheets stored on the upper shelves. He quickly made the bed while David stood near the door, watching everything with those big, tired eyes. And when he finished, he turned to the boy and said, "You can sleep here tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." David slowly walked to the bed and climbed in, curling his small body under the sheets. Victor pulled the blanket up to the boy's chin and stood there for a few seconds, looking at that tired little face, which was already starting to relax with the warmth of the bed, and felt something clench in his chest again, something that was both painful and comforting. David opened his eyes again and looked at Victor with a frightened expression and said in a weak voice, "You're not going to leave, are you?" Victor shook his head slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm not leaving. I'll stay right here." David seemed to relax a little at those words, but still held Victor's hand tightly, as if afraid he would disappear if he let go. Victor sat there on the edge of the bed, holding the boy's small, cold hand, watching him finally begin to drift off to sleep, his breathing becoming slower and deeper, his face finally relaxing after so much suffering. Victor looked around the dark room and felt the weight of everything that had happened that day fall upon him all at once. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to handle the situation. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, but he knew he couldn't abandon that boy. He couldn't leave him alone again. He sat there for almost an hour until he was sure David was sleeping soundly. Then he slowly released his hand and carefully stood up so as not to wake him. Victor left the room, leaving the door ajar, and stood in the hallway for a few minutes, trying to process everything that had happened, trying to understand what this meant for him and his life, which was completely destroyed. He slowly went downstairs and returned to the room where everything had begun, looking at the marble floor where he and David had embraced, crying together, and felt the tears return to his eyes, because all of this had affected him in a way he wasn't prepared for. It had opened wounds he had tried to keep closed for so long. Victor sat down on the cold floor and leaned his back against the wall, looking up at the high ceiling and feeling the heavy silence of the mansion envelop him again. But now it was different. Now he wasn't completely alone. Now someone was sleeping upstairs, someone who depended on him, who needed him, and that changed everything. He sat there for hours, thinking about everything that had happened, thinking about what to do next, thinking about David's mother and what might have happened to her, thinking about how he was going to care for a 7-year-old boy when he could barely care for himself. The hours passed slowly, and the night grew darker and quieter. Victor remained sitting on the floor, lost in thought and painful memories he had tried to bury, but which now returned all at once. He thought of the wife he had lost, the son he never saw grow up, the life that had been ripped away from him so brutally and suddenly, and felt the familiar pain tighten his chest again. That pain that accompanied him every day and never completely went away. But now along with that pain there was something more. There was a strange sense of responsibility, of purpose, of needing to be strong for someone, and that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Victor finally got up from the floor when the clock marked almost 3 a.m. and slowly went upstairs, checking if David was still sleeping before heading to his own room at the end of the hall. He entered the room he hadn't properly used for months, where he only lay down when exhaustion was so great he couldn't stay awake anymore, and collapsed onto the bed without taking off his suit, staring at the dark ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened on that impossible day. Victor closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come because his head was too full of unanswered questions, full of worries, full of fear of what lay ahead. He lay there for hours, tossing and turning, until exhaustion finally won, and he fell into a restless sleep full of nightmares, waking up several times during the night, his heart racing and cold sweat on his forehead. When the sun finally began to rise and the faint morning light entered the bedroom window, Victor opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling for a few minutes, remembering everything that had happened the day before and realizing it hadn't just been a dream, that there really was a boy sleeping in the next room, a boy who was alone and scared and who now depended on him. Victor slowly got up and went to the bathroom, washing his face with cold water and looking at his reflection in the mirror, seeing a tired, aged man with deep, dark circles and disheveled hair, a man who had given up on life a long time ago and who now needed to find the strength to care for someone else. He left the room and slowly walked down the hall until he reached the door of David's room and opened the door slowly, so as not to make noise,